Good morning. Thank you, Paul. I almost don't want to say anything further. I think that you read that so exquisitely. Thank you so much. There's such power in that, and as this week has begun, I started back with yoga and a couple of teaching classes and some projects at work. So this book is called One Mind, and that's kind of like what my mind is. And you see that? The thing is, I'm so eager to tag a page, and then, where was that? Where was that? But I have some information that I want to share. So this service will have to do with some information that I found in a couple of my favorite magazines, Spirituality and Health. I came across those magazines many years ago, and I find it very profound because it's a blend of my love for medicine and nursing and also spirituality. So I'll be sharing some of those words of wisdom. But one of the questions in my class this week, because I'm doing body and mind connection, and one of the first questions is, what do you think God is? So whenever I take a class, I have to start researching and remembering what is my answer to those questions. Because we're always growing in our understanding of what God is. We're always growing. And in that, knowing that we're expanding our awareness and expanding our consciousness, the simple truth that knowing that this God self, this seed, this holy, holy, holy place within us is our touchstone for all else that we experience in our world. So I appreciate how beautifully Paul read that, because it captures Ernest Holmes' thoughts on this divine presence dwelling within us. So my talk at the 9 o'clock, because it's all about compassion and connection, and I think what a better time in our world to speak more deeply, more profoundly about compassion with all that's going on in our world, our own personal lives, and also what we see within the world in suffering, and on this auspicious day of the International Peace Day. And this day, there's several people that join me year after year. Laurie Barnes and Michael Bordeaux and Charlie Bourne have been so dedicated to present this service. Sometimes we have 3 people out in the audience. Other times we've had quite a few show a heart of interest for that. But what I appreciate about the founder of International Peace Day, Jeremy Tilley, something like that, he started this movement in 1999. He had a vision, he had a heart, he had a movement of wanting to have a day dedicated in the United Nations for let's put down the arms. Let's put down the arms and let's practice nonviolence. Just a day. Just start with a day. And it took him a while to get the United Nations to hear him. His movement has grown and populated this world, and they have this huge goal by 2016 to really create a great new cause in our world. And last year, with his movement, they were able to get into Afghanistan and to work with the Taliban to allow all the healthcare workers to immunize. And they did thousands and thousands of immunizations for polio for those children and for that community of people. And it was because of his work. So we have this tonight we're starting with Lynn's drum to really invoke the presence of spirit in that form. So wonderful, that Native American tradition. And then we'll be sharing the prayer for the world after that. And Diana and Chris will be joining us. So I'm advertising that because I think it's very powerful. And the one question, if you can't join us tonight, that Jeremy has posed for this year's consciousness is, who or what can I make peace with? Your question, to dwell in your heart. So I leave that with you as I move on to this. I want to share the first story and see how it reaches into you. This was written by Mark Nepo, and it's called Open Your Heart. And he's written many, many books, but this was a very personal sharing, so hear his words with me. During the last 8 months of my father's life, he was in and out of the hospitals and rehab centers. I had flown in to see him again. When I arrived, he was sleeping, and my brother said he was having a hard day, so I sat by his side. When he woke, he didn't know who I was. This had never happened before. Now, how many of you have gone through that with an elder? You know, it's a tender place. It's a haunting place. There was a moment in my life on the day I got married that I was so excited, but my dad looked at me like, "Who are you?" And I remember just going through a haunting, cold feeling went through me. My dad doesn't know me. And then it cleared. It was just brief. He was just probably overwhelmed with all the activity. But I remember that level of haunting feeling of separation from the Father in that way. So though I haven't experienced that a lot intimately with some of the elders in my life, I saw some hands raised and my heart goes out to you. That's a struggle. So that had never happened to him before. His reaction was, I was stunned, and it felt odd and evacuating to have my father stare with enormously wide eyes as if I were a stranger. My heart began to sink, and I thought, so this is what it will feel like when he's gone. I took his hand and tried to remind him, "Hi, Dad, I'm Mark, I'm your son." He looked at me like an old miner trapped underground. He looked at me as if to say, "Am I still here? Are you here to help me?" My heart began to tumble in this canyon between us. But it was suddenly clear that in this moment, I had to be kind. I had to be a kind stranger. I gave up trying to have him recognize me, and I sat closer, introducing myself for the first time. "Hi, I'm Mark. I'm here to help you, to keep you company. How are you today?" And his stare softened, and he gripped my hand, thankful for some company. Then he looked beyond me as if to say, "No one can get me out of this. No one." Later that night, he knew me again. But this was a humbling episode in which I was challenged to feel the unnerving moment that I was erased from the consciousness of the man who had fathered me and to enter a reality that existed beyond my feelings, my story, or even my life. Without denying either, it was also a deeply personal moment of knowing that all things are true. This was my father, the man who held me as a boy, who cried but didn't show up when I had cancer, who was lost to me for 15 years, who cried in my arms when he was 90, who didn't know I was his son at 93. All of it's true, and it's imperative not to choose between them, but to let the many faces of my father wash into the many sides of his son's aching heart. What I've learned from these passages is that the heart not only has room for both, but that life demands that we embrace both. What is particular to each of us and what exists in mysteriously complexity beyond our singular life. I've learned that the bird must feel its broken wing and the current of wind that lifts and twirls and carries it. This is what it means to be a bird. As a person, we must feel both the break in our heart and the current of life that lifts and twirls and carries us. This is what it means. This is what it means to be open-hearted. Now, I barely could read through that because so often individuals come to a practitioner wanting not to feel the suffering that they find themselves in. And we can't take that suffering away as a practitioner. We can hold the pain with you, but know that you're walking through it, that it's part of the human condition. And when we can start to recognize that truth, that suffering is, just as what the Buddha said, you can have all of the riches in the world as he did as a young man, and then he had to go out into the world and he saw suffering for the first time. And that made his heart ache, troubled him just as it does each and every one of us here. It's part of the human experience. And what we find when we sit and dwell in places of absolute suffering is a level of compassion that emerges from our heart and has the power and the courage to reach out and embrace that suffering. There was another article that spoke of the woman reminding us, the author of this article reminded us to lean in to the suffering. Not to try to manipulate it and change it, fix it. Lean into it. And do we have the courage to do that? Do we have the courage to lean into someone's suffering? Of course we do. It's the nature of our heart. It's the nature of our makeup. It's the God seed within us. It's the holy, holy, holy place within us. It's the realized place within us that longs to reach out and to embrace and to lift up and to be the wing that helps to carry that brokenness in another. So there's an idea of developing self-compassion for the moments that you find your own self in a place that feels in anguish and in suffering. And so there was the idea introduced to develop a self-compassion mantra. Here's the self-compassion mantra that one particular woman named, her name's Christina Neff, and she had an autistic son that used to just throw these tantrums. And she'd always want to try to, it was so embarrassing in public, so she would try to just feel love for her son, compassion, but also humiliation at the same time. So this is what she would say for herself. This is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I give myself the compassion that I need. Can you do that? Can you remember those moments when you find yourself in some form of discomfort within your own self, not to run to an addictive pattern, to try to numb what you feel, but to turn to it, to lean into it, to name it, to feel it, to breathe with it, to know what it is, to be able to express it to a beloved friend, or even to speak it out loud, to write it down, and to get it all out of you, all the ugliness, let it just pour out. But then ask yourself, may I be kind to myself in this moment and give myself the compassion that I need? So it went on to develop three elements of self-compassion, and I wanted to bring those to you. And the first one, of course, is this self-kindness. It means being warm and understanding towards ourselves when we suffer or when we fail or when we're feeling inadequate, rather than ignoring our pain or continually allowing that self-critic to just turn on its tape and take its residence within us. Recognize that being imperfect, that failing and experiencing any kind of life difficulty is inevitable. Now you might think, oh, that's not a very happy message. But please take that in to know maybe you're in a place where you have the strength of heart to reach out and be the one that people are leaning into in this moment. It's a balance in our life. It's a dance. It's a dance with one another. But please also know when you're in those fragile moments yourself, we are here for you to lean into. The other second element is common humanity. Self-compassion involves recognizing the suffering and personal inadequacy is part of the shared human experience, something that we all go through rather than it being something that happens to just you alone. And that brings comfort too, in an odd way, just knowing that when we see the suffering, for example, I had an email, people were emailing me wondering if I knew anyone in Weed with the fires. And I thought to myself, it didn't matter. It doesn't matter if we know somebody or not. What matters is that we lift our consciousness into the place of holding those that are suffering, all the nameless ones, into a place where they are safe and comforted, that every animal, every tree, every plant, every insect is finding a place of safety. Because the moment of the suffering, we can't blow out the fire in that moment and have it just, that didn't happen. No, we have to watch the flames and feel that suffering, but also then call upon ourselves, well, how can I donate? How can I reach out there and serve in another way to help the nameless? And so in this idea that it's a shared human experience, we allow the heart space continually to open. And there's ways to allow yourself this place of deep empathy, to allow yourself a moment to really say, yes, I will stay open here. And there's areas of suffering. Whenever I see an animal on the road that just got hit, I can just feel myself cringe. But I have to put my hands over my heart and know and pray for that animal, that it had no more suffering, that it is evolving to a greater place. Whatever it is for you, whatever helps you to take your hand to lead you out of the place of suffering, so we don't just cringe and turn away, but we look at it with heart wide open. Something we're all going through, we have to name our thoughts, name our feelings, feel that whatever there is out there in the environment and in the expectations of others, sometimes we're putting these expectations on one another, and sometimes it's important just to step back and let it be with an open heart. Thich Nhat Hanh says that this is recognizing that within each one of us, Ernest Holm calls it that holy, holy place. He talks about it, Thich Nhat Hanh, the interbeing. Recognizing our essential inner being allows us to be less judgmental about our own personal failings. How many people would consciously choose to have anger issues, addiction, debilitating social anxiety, eating disorders? Nobody's really choosing those. We get trapped in those. And so as we evolve in our consciousness, as we do our spiritual practice, as we do our affirmations and our prayers and our deep knowing, as we sit into the sacred texts and allow ourselves to really embody that, to allow our heart to be fed, the walls of our heart are lined with these great passages of truth. That's what we can call upon in those moments of suffering. So it calls upon the third reflection for you to think about today is mindfulness. So there's self-kindness, there's a common humanity, and there's mindfulness. This requires a very balanced approach to our negative emotions. So we're not suppressing them and we're not exaggerating. So we find a place where we can find harmony and equilibrium within our own self. It's a place where we can sit very mindfully without judgment. We're not going to ignore our pain. We're going to feel compassion at the same time. They did an interesting study because with how the Nazis could get to a place where they could do the horrific acts they did to another man, to mankind itself, okay? They were able to separate themselves, to close that heart space, and to not have any empathy at all, to just close it down, to shut it down, and to feel that the other people were not a part of them. So you can see the integral part, how empathy and compassion play in the deep healing of our community. So in these opportunities, you have the chance to write yourself a letter, to do your own self-talk, to develop your own personal mantra. This is the moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of my life. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I give myself the permission and the compassion that I need. So when I speak of the empathy, I'm going to talk more about some of the studies that came out of some of the sciences that they've done with animals, but one of them is a mirror neuron. This is something that they've developed and understood in their studies of science over the past several years. Within us, we have a neuron that mirrors the suffering or the behavior of others. And so when we develop those neurons, we develop compassion and empathy. And they did this study in particular with some rats. And this was written by in the One Mind book by Larry Dossey, and he's a physician himself, and he doesn't like rats, he said, because he got bit by one when he was in school. So he already had like that separation, that I didn't want to be part of this. But he had a whole nother feeling when he allowed himself, now here it is, allowing himself to really see and observe the behavior. And so in these special tubes, I hope I share this story right, but in these special tubes, they had these rats. One particular rat had a goal of getting through these tubes to his chocolate chips that he loved. And another tube was a rat that had a latch on the door that couldn't get out. Well, this rat that was free to go through the tubes would not touch those chocolate chips until he freed his buddy. And he would go over there and fuss, and it wasn't an easy latch, but he would just work with that latch until he could release that, and then they both would go enjoy the chocolate chips together. Other times, he figured this out right away. He said, okay, there's chocolate chips, got to go open and let my buddy out, and he started to figure that out a little quicker. Other times, he went in there, got all the chocolate chips, brought them over, hoarded them, saved his friend, shared them still. Shared them still. Where does that come from? That's an innate level of compassion and empathy, dwelling within all beings, all creatures, as in the rat, as in you. Now, how do you feel about that? Yeah, as in the rat, as is in you. So, and I have some other stories that I'll be talking a little bit more about that. But this idea of leaning into, I wanted to expand on that a little bit as well, and how the author came to that. She was sitting next to a young woman that she found just sobbing uncontrollably. And sometimes we see those situations and we just want to turn. Charlie and I were driving around yesterday and we saw a young man with a Coke cup, and he's just talking to the world, talking with his cup, talking to the people in the cars, but talking with his cup and walking across the street, just as happy as can be, but not there in my judgment world. I thought, well, he's happy. He's happy, but, how do you approach someone like that? And he doesn't really need anything, and he got across the street just fine. But how many times do you just want to go, pretend I didn't see that? So here's somebody that's crying, and I had this experience when Charlie had to go to the emergency room, and I saw somebody else, a young girl crying by herself. And so I thought, Charlie, you're okay. Sorry. You were. But I went and sat with her instead. And her story, as she got through crying, she was in a lot of pain, and she'd been waiting and waiting and waiting to be seen. And so I went up to the window and I said, did you forget about this young woman? She's out here, she's suffering. Oh, she's on the list, we'll go check. And so I went back and I just held her hand, and she finally told me that she was having a miscarriage and that nobody knew that she was pregnant. And I said, well, is there anybody we can call to sit with you through this? You should not be alone. And she said, I don't want anybody to know. And it's just I could really relate to this story. So I said, I'll sit with you until they call you back. And Charlie went out and did his test, and I just knew that he was okay because my love goes with him always. And then in that moment, though, she stopped crying and we could talk about some other things. So this particular person was suffering in this way, and the author of the article said, I couldn't get her sadness out of my mind. At my age, I'd experienced a fair share of suffering, lost relationships, near-fatal auto accidents, losing dear friends. The story came to my mind about sadness. It surprises me. It happened to a young student of mine in Detroit, and she looked like this young woman, full of life, very lovely, with a rare intensity. And this particular person was working as a high-end escort for businessmen, visiting the city on weekends. The way I remember it, she had several regular clients that were saving up with a plan to get out of the business when she got into another argument with her boyfriend about it. he was wanting her to stop this kind of work. He said, decide right now, or I'll kill myself. Well, she was so panicked and hysterical that she was trying to call someone, and she called this particular person at the temple. He thought that was too much of a delay, and he shot himself right in front of her. Took her, of course, horrific suffering when you see somebody take their life right in front of you. And so this idea, it took a long time for people to get close to her and to lean into her and to help lift her out of this suffering. It was overwhelming, as you can imagine. But the first noble truth of Buddhism, and in all spiritual practices or lineages, you can find that this level of suffering is. And it's where we have to reach out. It's how Jesus walked on our planet at his time. He saw the suffering, he would reach into it, and he would lift it up. So always she found that the second truth to offer the way through suffering is just that, go straight through it. So I leave you with that idea when you find yourself, you and your personal suffering, go straight through it. Hold it, name it, feel it. Take your hands to your heart. There's ways they've scientifically discovered just by placing your own hands over your heart, and that places the suffering, drops it from the mind, takes it to the heart where there is a natural tendency to feel the oxytocin is released into the body, and there is this sense of a self-hug, a nurturing that goes to the heart space. And also just across the belly space of your body, to just allow yourself to hold and contain some of the suffering, the anxiety that you feel, these personal ways of touching into your own suffering, and to feel that this too shall pass. This too shall pass. And I am willing to be the spiritual warrior and walk through my own journey and be the hand that somebody else reaches out to hold as they're walking through their journey, going through the suffering. So this final words to live by, breathing in, this is the most important part here, holding the self, breathing in, I return to the island of just this moment. Here is where the sky and the ground and the air hold me up, comforting me. Breathing out, I begin again. Breathing in, you can feel the suffering. Breathing out, you know you can begin again. It is the breathing out, it is the letting go, it is the so it is that we long to anchor our deep conscious knowing. So join with me in a beautiful treatment, and I want to share just these words of Ernest Holmes. Remember the inner presence, the great and mighty, the inner light, the light that shines so brightly. Ernest Holmes speaks these words as well. As I flip through here. The Christ Spirit comes to all alike. So think of the holy, holy place. Think of that inner place within you. The Christ Spirit comes to all alike, proclaiming itself as the Son of God, even unto the humble in spirit. Proud of his divinity, yet humble before the greatness of the whole, Jesus spoke from the heights of spiritual perception, proclaiming the deathless reality of the individual life, the continuity of the individual soul, the unity of universal spirit within all men. This was the Christ speaking, the Son, begotten of the only Father, the Son of God. Humble in his humanity, compassionate in his tenderness, understanding the frailties of the human mind. He let the great Spirit speak through him in words of love and sympathy. He proclaimed his divinity through his humanity and taught that all men are brothers. Ernest Holmes. Words of the heart. Allow your own heart to receive, not to turn away, to open. to allow the message of this day for self-compassion, for deep compassion, for your own suffering, for the suffering of what you see around you, to breathe it in. And as you breathe out, to see a greater idea unfolding, to see a greater revelation of truth. For our own self and for each person that we see in a place of suffering, we lift them up with our consciousness, with our breath, with our heart, with our thoughts. We allow this day dedicated to international peace, to open our hearts into an awareness that we are willing to lean into suffering and to offer our heart, to offer our truth, to offer our words of compassion and empathy, to feel what needs to be felt, and to express what needs to be said, to allow the divine to flow through us in a holy, holy way. I have the privilege to speak this day on behalf of peace, on behalf of compassion and empathy, on the behalf of each and every one of you. May our hearts be open. May this truth reside forevermore. I give thanks for this opportunity, for grace as it speaks, as it moves through each and every one of us. Thank you, God, and so it is.